Okay, hello everybody. A very warm welcome to this event between Live with Scientists and Autism at Manchester. And first of all, I'm going to introduce who we are, who are doing this event today. So there's myself, Emma Gowan, and Lene Buckle. We are researchers in cognitive neuroscience. So that's trying to understand how the brain does things like plan and think and see and move. I'm a non-autistic researcher and Lene is an autistic researcher. We've also got Peter Bainbridge, who's an autistic person and CEO of Salford Autism, which is a support group run by autistic people for autistic people. We've also got Kerry Ellis and Dan Paul, who are both non-autistic researchers. Kerry works in the field of evidence-based interventions and Dan works in the field of psychology. And just to give you a sense of our backgrounds, because of us all being autism focused or autism related with our research, this event has a focus really on autism. However, a lot of what we say and discuss can be applied to other conditions as well. And also, just to highlight what we mean by research, here we are meaning that it's scientific research with human participants. So there's a series of stages that are done in a particular scientific methodology. So what should you expect today? So we're going to talk about what research involvement actually means, what can go wrong if involvement doesn't happen, and how can we enable this involvement. And we're going to be using a mixture of slides, some discussion, videos, and some poll questions, and that the poll questions will come up on your screen. For the first poll question, you'll have a minute just to familiarise yourself with the layout of the questions. And then after that, each poll question will be 30 seconds. We'll take questions at the end, so if you pop them into the chat, they'll then be read out to us. Okay, so we're going to start with our first poll question. Oh, Peter.
Question number 1. How have you been involved in research before?
Okay, so you should be able to see the poll question up on your screens now. So please go ahead and make your responses. Okay, that looks like just about everybody has responded there. So I'm going to just share the results. And so what we can see is we've got a fair mixture. So a few of you have been involved as participants. Some of you haven't been in research involved before, and some of you are as a researcher. Interestingly, nobody as an advisor or consultant. So we'll be talking a little bit more about that. Okay. So let's explore what it is we actually mean by involvement. And what we're conveying today is that involvement means the involvement of people that the research is about. So in our case, involving autistic people in our research. And there's different types of involvement. Most of them are good and useful, but they're not all equally useful or equally beneficial. So we start at the bottom of this table here. There's a type of involvement that is called engagement. So you might have heard of engagement, public engagement. And this is an example would be researchers providing clear and accessible information about the study and the study findings. So this tends to happen after all the planning of the research has been done. So there's not really a way that the the people that the research is about can particularly change the research at that time. Then if we move up to this second level, we've got actually what we call, we've termed involvement. And this is a more active consultation between researchers and the people that the research is about. So this could involve consultation with discussion and feedback processes, in our case between researchers and the autistic community. So some examples would be expert by experience groups. So this is where autistic people and family members would advise on research. People can get involved in research as in an advisory role or on steering groups. So they meet regularly with the researchers during the research and can change the course of the research that way. But then also, if you participate in research during the early piloting stages of that research, you can be given opportunities to influence the research by providing feedback about that design and whether it was particularly, you thought it could be improved. Then if we go to the top level here, there's a type of involvement called participatory involvement. And this is research that is actually led by the people that the research is about. So in our case, led by autistic researchers. It can also mean a fairly equal collaboration or partnership between autistic and non-autistic researchers. And this tends to occur right from the start of the research. So we can see that in we've covered what the different types of involvement are. So we're going to move to our second poll question, which Kerry is going to introduce.
Thanks, Emma. So we're very lucky to have had a video sent to us by Sid, who's going to present a great example of a misconception about stimming. So the term stimming is short for self-stimulatory behaviour, and some autistic people may stim. A few examples could be things like hand flapping or spinning, things like repeating words or phrases as well, amongst many, many other examples. So Sid is going to present his misconception, and then there's going to be a poll question for you to answer.
Hi, I'm Sid. I'm autistic, and I've also done some research with Autism at Manchester into various things to do with autism. My question is, do you think that research has shown that stimming behaviours cause meltdowns?
Poll question number 2. Do you think the research has shown that stimming behaviours cause meltdowns?
Okay, so you should see the poll question up now. Okay, so I'm going to share the results there. We've got a fair few people who aren't sure about that question, and some of you who are thinking no. So I will move on to what Sid says.
So unfortunately, the answer is true. There has been research that has shown that stimming behaviours cause meltdowns. This research was done in 2017 and is a very good example of why we need to include the groups that we are researching in our research, because as far as we can tell, this study didn't consult any autistic people or what they thought about the question, but they concluded by measuring stimming behaviours from autistic people and whether or not they then had a meltdown, that these stimming behaviours caused the meltdowns, which as I mentioned, I'm autistic, so I can almost guarantee that if you ask an autistic person, they would turn around and say that the stimming behaviors are trying to prevent the meltdowns. And that's fairly backed up. So it's just a very good example of a group of researchers who haven't consulted the community that they're researching on, and therefore their research has kind of ended up with fundamental flaws in it. Thanks.
Okay, so Sid has begun to bring this up a little bit. So we're going to do a poll question now, following on from what Sid said.
Poll question number 3. Why do you think it is important for researchers to involve people that the research is about?
Okay, I'm bringing up the question now. Great, okay, let's end the poll, we'll share the results. So got most of you thinking to make sure the research is useful, which is great. And we've got some also answers there about satisfying funders and gaining ethical approval. So we'll explore some of these a little bit more in the next slides.
Yeah, so a nice perspective there, a mix of views on why we should be doing this. There really are a whole load of moral, ethical and scientific reasons why we'd be working closely with some of the groups we're researching. Before Linnae goes on to talk about this and from the research perspective, I'm just going to take a little step to the side and I'm going to consider a recent case study on this outside the research world from the arts. So this is the recent controversy around the film Music, which was made by the musician Sia, who's in the bottom left of your screen there. So this film follows an autistic main character who's named Music, with musical dance sequences to illustrate how music sees the world. Late last year, before the film had even been released, questions were beginning to be asked about why they'd hired a non-autistic actress to play an autistic character. As time went on, clips from the film were released, and it was becoming clear that the portrayal was really a really exaggerated and outdated stereotype of autism, which really comes across as mocking. And then what was starting to happen was before the film had even been released, the filmmakers were issuing apologies, which isn't really how I imagine they were intending for this to pan out. Subsequently, the film received extremely negative reviews, and most of these reviews really comment on how offensive the portrayal of the main character has been. I've not seen the film myself. I have watched the trailer. I don't think this was ever destined to be a piece of high art, but if they'd worked more closely with autistic people when making the film, they might very easily have avoided making something that's going to be remembered for being offensive and upsetting people, and the controversy surrounding it, rather than judging it on any of its artistic merits.
Right. So the same thing applies to research, that you can do a lot better if you talk to the people. So well-meaning but misguided researchers often think that autism makes people unhappy, so making them less autistic will make them more happy, as Sid was talking about in his question. But this can lead to removing stress management and regulation behaviors like stimming that prevents meltdowns, ignoring communication attempts like some autistic people communicate by copying what other people say or what they've heard on TV. And this is considered to be an autistic trait, and sometimes it's stamped out. But you can also turn this characteristic called echolalia into, you can use it to learn to communicate, but if you stamp it out, then they have no way of learning to communicate. And when you teach an autistic person to hide who they are, their autism, then that is the constant stress from acting like you are a different person. And this leads to stress, problems, and mental health issues. The same sorts of things apply outside of autism. So autism is our expertise, but the same thing applies to anything where you're looking at a condition that people have. So when parents have a deaf baby, babies are often diagnosed straight away as being deaf with the screening, and then they're asked if they want their baby to have a cochlear implant. This completely changes how they are, how they communicate, and it to a large extent excludes them from deaf culture, which is its own thing. So parents of deaf babies, who are mostly hearing people, are making a decision about their child's future without actually knowing what a good deaf life looks like. And similarly, people are making decisions about interventions for their autistic children without knowing what a good autistic life looks like. And on the other side of this is that they might fail to target the things that are actually important. So like the thing that attracts the most interest about schizophrenia is that they have hallucinations and delusions. So that's very exciting, and that attracts a lot of research. But there are things like depression and withdrawal and not being able to do things that are more important to the people who actually have schizophrenia. So they'd like more research on these more mundane sort of problems that they have. So for autism specifically, researchers need to be asking, what does a good autistic life look like? Because then they can work on making those who aren't having it and on helping them to achieve that. And what is important to autistic people, and what do they want help with? And how can we work with, not against, the way autistic minds work? Okay, next.
Great. So we've found out a little bit more about why it's important to involve the people that you're researching, and we're going to start thinking a little bit more about that with our poll question 4.
Poll question number 4. To what extent do you think researchers involve the people that they are researching?
Okay. And hopefully you should see that now. Okay, I'll share the results of that. So we've got again a little bit of a mixture there. Reasonably, I'd say, well-informed audience here. So I think, Dan, were you going to start us off here with a discussion around?
Oh, yes, I was just going to make a point about that. So occasionally probably is a very reasonable reflection of the state of affairs. Yeah, the interesting point that I wanted to make on this topic was it's thinking about researchers' own perspectives on what they're doing. So there was some really seminal work that came out a couple of years ago, around 2014, 2015, from researchers working at the Centre for Research in Autism and Education down in London. They surveyed stakeholders in autism research, so autistic people, parents of autistic children, researchers, practitioners, and so on. And autism was, interestingly, the autism researchers perceived themselves to be doing a generally good job at engaging and working and involving autistic people in the work they were doing. This wasn't really matched up with the perspectives of autistic people and their families, who really felt that researchers weren't doing enough, that they really weren't aware of how to get involved in research. What's more as well, the researchers also had quite different ideas about what engagement might look like, what that should look like to autistic people. So this really highlights that the researchers generally aren't doing enough to get the communities involved in the work they're doing, and there's this real disconnect between what the researchers think themselves about what they're doing and what they're actually doing in practice.
I think that's really interesting, Dan. So based on kind of what we've heard already in terms of, autistic priorities, and it's really clear that autistic individuals kind of definitely want greater involvement in research in general, and want their voice heard much better in the research process. But I wonder kind of what is the amount of involvement, kind of how that might change depending on the population being researched. So autism, for example, might fit into that sort of social condition, but it might be a different case for more sort of medical based conditions.
Yeah, so I'd agree with that. So I have multiple sclerosis, MS, and you would consider this more of a medical condition than a social condition. And from my experience, I would say that the MS community seems to be more trusting of researchers than the autism community. And they tend to want involvement in research and hearing about the research, but less wanting to do the participatory and leading of that research. So we'll move this on. So we're understanding about why we need to involve people. We're going to start exploring why that doesn't happen. So what are the potential barriers for involving the people that the research is about? And we'll kick this off with another poll question.
Poll question number 5. What is research for?
And you should see this on your screen now. Okay, so I'll end that and share the results. That's great. I like that everybody is thinking that it's to gain knowledge. I think that's one of the key things. But as you can see, there's a variety of reasons for conducting research. And we'll explore a little bit more about this and barriers with Dan now.
Thanks, Emma. Yeah, so probably we'd agree, and the audience seems to be in agreement with this, that the real reason why an autism researcher might do autism research is in order to enhance knowledge, in order to improve autistic people's lives. Now, it's worth noting there are a number of different stakeholders in autism research. So I've just, in this figure here, I've included as many as I could think of. There may well be more. All these different stakeholders have different perspectives on where research effort and funding should be best directed in order to achieve this, improving knowledge to improve people's lives. So just to give an example of that, clinicians working in autism might believe the best route is early identification of autism. On the other hand, basic scientists might want to better understand the mechanisms which underlie challenges which autistic people face as the route to improving this understanding. The thing is, none of these groups will have a fixed or a universal within their group view on what is best. And this understanding is really going to change over time as well. So this really highlights the importance that autistic people remain here in the centre of research in which their views shape how we understand why obtaining that knowledge is important, and also what improving people's lives looks like. It is worth acknowledging that there are some practical obstacles. So, as in most things, time and money. Now, to give some more specific examples here, it's worth knowing researchers are doing research as their job. The way that academic research is now organised mean that many researchers, so including myself, people doing the nitty-gritty of everyday research, are employed on insecure short-term contracts, and we're often required to move around in order to find work. Now, this can make it very difficult for researchers to form the connections and develop those sort of trusting relationships that are really needed for effective and fully participatory work. Even if you're fortunate enough to make it into a permanent fixed position, researchers are still under pressure that their research is being published in the top tier, the fanciest journals, in order to hold on to their jobs. And so you might argue, many researchers might cynically think that the best strategy is to just focus their energy, focus their efforts on making sure that they're getting those publications in those journals, rather than taking the longer term, the slower route, which involves developing and really nurturing these kinds of collaborations. Sadly, what tends to be seen as high impact by management within university systems isn't really the same as what the public would see as high impact and as autistic people's lives. A related issue around this as well is that when we are doing this kind of work, it's important for us that, it's fundamentally very important, that autistic people are being remunerated for their expertise. However, we're working in an environment where everyone is being expected to do more and more for less. And there can be few or sometimes no revenue streams which are really available for sorting this out appropriately. Even when money is actually available, so for instance, by a researcher could win a large grant, there usually isn't money that's provided up front at that early stage. Like Emma mentioned before, fully participatory research involves autistic people being involved in the entire life cycle from the very beginning, in that whole process of conceiving of and designing the study.
Great, thank you, Dan. I think it's great that we've got to be very open and honest about these issues. We try to do our best, but there are barriers, and I think it's good to get the message out there. So we're going to move on to poll question 6.
Poll question number 6. Is it true that autism primarily affects boys?
Okay, so you should see this on your screen. Great, so I'll share the results. All right, we have, I'd say, a fairly well-informed audience today. So I think Kerry is going to chat a little bit about this question.
Yeah, so I'd first of all like to thank Helen Clark, who sent in this misconception. And she's also kindly shared some thoughts with us about her response to this question from her own perspective and experience. So from her personal experience, she's found that girls and women can be dismissed when they raise the topic of being autistic. And she's also found that some women don't pursue the diagnosis further, but might as well take it up in life, later in life. She says that from her experience, she's heard anecdotal evidence that some have been told that they are too pretty, that some have empathy, so they can't be autistic, that they're too capable to be autistic, you know, especially for women who have relationships and jobs. Other reasons might be the ability to give eye contact, but research has shown, as Helen points out, that autistic girls can mask their differences well, as well. So some of the reasons why girls and women may not get diagnosed or might be missed due to factors such as the diagnostic tools that are classically used in diagnostic services may not sort of pick up on the nuances in autistic girls and women's kind of behaviour. There's a kind of inherent gender bias and a lack of awareness and training sometimes in different health and education settings. So autistic girls and women might also experience other inequalities across health and education as well. And sometimes girls and women might be struggling more than others in relation to their mental health, especially adolescents as well. So Helen points out that sometimes some autistic girls have many strengths. So some may have good expressive language skills that might overshadow their difficulties in more kind of understanding of language as well. But we'd like to thank Helen again for raising this really important topic, and just to point out that she has written a book about this called Spectacular Girls. So if you are interested, please pop that into Google, and Helen Clark as well, and hopefully you can see more information about that.
Thanks. I think Lene and Peter, did you want to come in on this?
Certainly do, big time. Want to go first, Lene?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Carrie, and to Helen for sending that. But I think that there are a few issues with it. It's all true, and they're really important points that that these are a problem for girls, and girls are way underdiagnosed, and they're diagnosed much later. And I'm a parent of a few autistic girls, 3 of them, who were diagnosed later than my boy, who was only 5, and the girls were 12 and 18. So we lived this, but to say that that it's false that it primarily affects boys is a bit simplistic, because we don't actually know yet. We know that girls are underdiagnosed, but we don't know by how much. So as far as we know at the moment, males are still more likely to be autistic than females, but not as disproportionate as the diagnosis right now. But there's the masking, girls and masking, like hiding their autism is a big topic these days, and very important for understanding mental health issues, especially. But there's a downside to thinking that girls equal masking, because boys who mask might not be acknowledged. And so there's an emerging stereotype about girl autism that's just as problematic as the traditional boy autism. So I think we need a balance, and to understand that there are many different expressions of autism in many different genders. So, Peter.
Sorry, I've just been trying to calm down a little bit. This subject always gets my goat, and I really want to say some very rude words to people. I think this does no more than demonstrate how crassly uninformed and ridiculously out of touch a lot of clinicians are. I really can't express myself politely on this subject, but what I did want to offer to the audience is the fact that in Salford, where we've been particularly active in chasing up GPs and the CCG, we are actually seeing parity of diagnosis between male and female, and that includes parity of submission. So there is actually a lot that can be achieved by informing the frontline services of the stupidity of the present concepts of female autism. It's just a nonsense. Yeah, okay, so women are different and women do everything differently. No big deal, we've been doing that since the year dot. But why should something that affects men not affect women? This is just a crazy idea.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter and Lene. That's great. So that's a very hot topic in autism research at the moment. We're going to move on back to Lene, who's going to enlighten us with some really nice examples of research that's driven by the people that the research is about.
Yeah, so I know quite a few autistic researchers. Most of them are not in neuroscience like I am. Most of them are sort of sociology, disability studies. There is an important paper by an autistic friend of mine a few years ago now, about 4 or 5 years ago, about the double empathy problem. So there's an idea that autistic people have less empathy than non-autistic people, and that this failure of empathy on the part of the autistic is the reason that autistics have problems interacting with non-autistic people. But what Damien Milton proposed is that actually the problem with empathy goes both ways, that autistic people do have trouble understanding non-autistic people, but it's also true the other way around. And since then, there's been some research that actually has studied this and whether autistic people can develop rapport with each other and exchange information with each other. And what they found was that autistic groups are fine if they're all autistic, and non-autistic groups are fine if they're all not autistic. And when they mix them, things start to go wrong. So there's now some actual research to back up the double empathy problem theory. There's also some research about autistic lives and what makes a good autistic life and how to make autistic lives better, because most of us are not saying that autistic people are not disabled. It's just that the answer to the disability isn't to make us not autistic. It's to provide proper support. So I'm currently doing a small project on what values are most important to autistic and other neurodivergent and atypical people, like dyslexics and ADHD and stuff. And there's some upcoming interest in social care research and some much more of a push on what sort of support actually works. And then there's research on how autistic minds work. So I know another autistic researcher who studies hyperfocus. This is one of the great strengths of being autistic. It has a downside, but being able to focus on doing something intensively all your waking hours and some hours that you ought to be sleeping, neglecting food and socializing and entertainment, no rest, work flat out for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks, because of this very intensive focus that's probably particularly common in autism. And what I'm researching is inertia, so that's related to the hyperfocus, but on the other side, the flip side of not being able to stop is not being able to start. And so a lot of autistic people have difficulty getting started on things that they need or want to do. So we need to study that more. And it's like with the symptoms of schizophrenia, this is one of the most important things to actually autistic people, but no research has been looking at it because they're much more interested in the social interaction, because that's what stands out most to non-autistic people. So there's some.
Brilliant, thanks, Lene. Peter, did I see you'd raised your hand? No. Okay. So we've seen that we've talked about what involvement is, and we've talked about why it's important and what the barriers are. And Lene's given some really nice examples of some participatory research. So we're going to finish with a brief summary of what Autism at Manchester is doing to try and facilitate greater involvement. So firstly, we are doing participatory research. So we work with autistic people. So autistic people are often co-producing, but leading the research as well. So like Lene was mentioning there. We have expert by experience groups. So this is where we've got autistic people and family members who regularly advise on research that the different research groups are doing. We develop and provide some guidelines and training to other researchers on some current best practices. This is always evolving because we're always learning too. That's the great thing about doing this, is it's never 100%. We're always learning better ways to work together. Was it about 4 years ago, we developed an internship for autistic students. Actually, Sid was one of the students, I think it was last year. So the autistic students can work in our autism research labs for the summer. And this helps to not only boost their CV, but hopefully get them more engaged with autism research. So maybe following a career into autism research, or if not that, having greater confidence to become more involved and have their say in the type of research that's going on. We have a regular newsletter, which we send out a couple of times a year with different research findings. Within that, we also advertise our events, which can happen throughout the year. So events like today, but also we've had events where we've had posters, so researchers presenting their findings and discussing these findings with the autism community. And then more recently, we've done a few things such as lobbying ethics committees. So this is where the research that you want to do, it needs to be approved by ethics committees. It needs to be seen that it's safe. And at this early stage, we think it's a great opportunity to make sure that the ethics committees, the applications have a question in them around how researchers are involving the community that they're researching. So a variety of aspects there, and if you've got any questions about this, I would like to get in contact, do contact me. Okay, so we're going to finish with our final poll question.
Poll question number 7. When you next take part in research, what level of involvement do you want?
Okay, you should see that. Brilliant. So I'll just end that and share the results. And that's great to see that actually quite a substantial amount of people listening today are wanting to be quite involved in research. So that's really encouraging to see. Nobody doesn't want to get involved, so that's a real positive. Fantastic. Okay, so that's the end of our slides. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed the event. As I mentioned, you can pop questions into the chat, which will be read out by one of our colleagues in Live with Scientists. Okay, so I'm just stopping sharing, and yeah, do let us know if there's any questions.
We've got a question come through, or a comment from one of our viewers, who says that they really appreciate you explaining the career motivations and problems for researchers. It's the first time that they've seen this done in public engagement, and they think that this should be standard practice on info and consent sheets. So I don't know if you've got any comments relating to that as well.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that message. So yes, we think a lot of this should be standard as well, and I think there's a lot of movement within autism research for this to be for more involvement and participatory research to happen. We have created some guidelines around this, and also created some training that we plan to give to our researchers in our labs to try and train more people to do, more researchers to do this in a more automatic way. I don't know if anybody else would like to comment further.
Can I just chip in there, because I just interpreting the comment as well, was it partially about the part that I was talking about barriers that researchers may experience? And yeah, I think it's an element that we don't really talk about, and it's something we should be upfront about in terms of having this like effective participatory work. We've always been quite keen to be transparent about the processes, the forces that are acting upon us, because that also helps guide how we can do this effectively, just being upfront and open, because it's quite understandable. People don't necessarily know much about research or how research will operate until they get actively involved. So I think that's a good suggestion about communicating this information as early as possible.
Yeah, and I think the openness is important. And I think in terms of Manchester, there's a lot of good stuff that the university supports us with our social responsibility, but sometimes that doesn't feed through on a personal level to when you are actually having as a researcher, your development reviews with your line manager. Often this stuff just takes second position to the research production. So that's the number of the papers, what journals are in terms of impact. So yeah, research impact as opposed to actual real life impact that they're having. And that again doesn't get talked enough about. So while there's some good movement going on with different aspects in different universities, I think certainly as a researcher, when you are having your P&DRs, your professional development reviews, this engagement involvement aspect doesn't have enough weighting.
Great. So we've got another question come through that's a bit more general. What do you think is more important, giving autistic people the resources they need to navigate sort of quotation marks normal society, or changing society to be more autism friendly?
It's a good question. Maybe I'll let Renee and Peter first talk about that.
Do you want to jump on that, Lenny?
Okay, I think both are really important, and it's and you can be quite sure that the ethics of changing society are pretty straightforward. It's not a problem. When it comes to changing a person, that's more problematic. But giving somebody tools, sometimes this is code for I want to make my kid behave normal. And sometimes it's not code, and it really means I want my child to be able to understand what people are expecting of her and how to understand what other people want and what they're doing. So for an individual autistic person, I think you're going to get farther faster by giving them tools. But we really need to work on changing society for everyone's sake, because that has a much wider impact, but it's slower, it takes longer. So that's
I'd very much support what Lenny said, and it's the main reason for the existence of Salford Autism. We're not going to be able to change the world tomorrow, but what we can do is educate as many non-autistic people as possible in terms of the problems and perceptions that autistic people experience. But also, in many cases, autistic people are actually able to navigate the outside world, provided they're given the understanding of what's going on. And Lenny's quite right. We should not be seeking to change anybody. Everybody's entitled to be exactly as they are. However, as most people who got up into management or have studied in a particular discipline, you have to learn rules, you have to acquire comprehension. And if you don't understand what non-autistic people are going on about, it's going to be very difficult to understand what on earth they're asking of you. So we spend a lot of time, we sometimes call it reparenting autistic adults, just to be able to understand why the outside world isn't conforming to what they anticipate and what they can do to help the outside world understand their needs better. And it's largely about communication, this double empathy problem, helping autistic people to understand that non-autistic people don't necessarily mean every single word they actually say. It is a very uphill battle, but it's true. Most non-autistic people use very, very padded language, and only some of it is what you need to know. Conversely, when autistic people say things, they tend to be straight to the point, do this, get that, and everybody thinks they're rude or aggressive, when in fact they're just being practical. So there's a long way to go. So I think education on both sides is the way to achieve it, and nobody needs to change, just a bit more information.
Yeah, thank you. This is why I really like working with Lene and Peter. I like these type of conversations that we're actually having live with lots of people as well. And I do just think a world where we are trying to better understand each other, autism or not, which Lene and Peter are advocating for here, is going to be a better world anyway.
Great, so we've got two more questions that are kind of linked, so I'm going to sort of pose them together. So we've got someone asking about whether there are many opportunities to take part in autistic research as a non-autistic student, sort of outside of university time, and somebody who's asking more specifically about getting involved in research with Salford at Autism, as they'd love to hear more and make an impact.
That's great to hear, that you're wanting to get involved, as a non-autistic person as well. If I mention a few things and then Peter can come in. So it depends what you'd like to do, whether you're interested in working in a lab and getting experience from that point of view of an autism research lab and training in participatory type approaches, in which case there are sometimes voluntary work experience, things like that. If you're actually wanting to get involved in the research itself, there's opportunities that because when we do research, we will do studies with autistic people, and we always tend to compare the results with non-autistic people. So there's opportunities to actually get involved in the direct studies as well. And I don't know if Peter, you want to say any more?
Yeah, other than Salford Autism is always open to new approaches, I think the best thing we can do is email me. Let's talk.
Fantastic. So we've got one more question I think we should have time for. So this person has asked, have you come across any barriers to involving particular members of the autistic community in research during the turn to online research?
So, good question. One of the biggest, I presume this is related to we are doing online research more because of COVID. I'm guessing that relates to. One of the big issues over the last year has been our research has had to stop. A lot of it has had to stop. And in the cases where we can actually put it online, we've had to do that. It's in some ways it's opened it up more in that people don't need to travel into the university, which can be stressful. So in some ways it's been useful. But I know that it probably is stopping some people getting involved in it as well. So I don't know. Other than a study we're just releasing, which is an interview study, and I think there's a few people who prefer that to be face-to-face rather than an interview over Zoom. I think that's an example where it's been quite difficult, I think, for some people to do it. Don't know if you've got any examples, Dan, at all.
There's mine.
Well, yes, yours, yeah.
Because I carried on through the first lockdown because I was already planning on doing online groups. I'd done some focus groups face to face, and then I was just on the verge of doing online ones because I wanted to run some entirely in text, so not Zoom meetings, because actually I find more than half of the autistic people I know struggle with video chat. But many prefer text only, and that's not even considered by most researchers or anybody else as a way of having meetings. So that's worked out quite well for us. I think there are always challenges though in involving people with limited communication, whether we're online or not, and I would say that's the most challenging part of involvement in autism research from my perspective.
Just to follow that up, Lene's got some nice guidelines that are on the Autism at Manchester site for researchers developing and running text-based focus groups. So I think that's something that was a really good idea that Lene had and did for her project.
Fantastic. So I think that's all the questions for now, which puts us perfectly on time. So thank you to everyone who's signed up and joined us today, and thank you so much to the Autism at Manchester team for a fantastic panel event. And we will be sending on links to the Autism at Manchester site so that you can follow up on any other questions that you've had, as well as links to our own site if you're interested in the Live with Scientists anniversary events that we've been running this month. So I don't know if you have any closing comments, Emma?
I don't think
or anyone.
For me, just thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you so much, everyone, and hope to see you soon.
Right.
Thanks, bye.